All right. If you can't hear me in the microphone, you can probably hear me talking, and that's enough. I'm mostly just using the microphone to record, but I will give you guys this so that you can ask questions and be recorded. Especially Glenna. Glenna said before you guys came that she especially wanted the microphone. Just a joke, Glenna. Okay, we are on night 4 of our church history class, and we are going to cover essentially 1750 to today, modern times. And we are going to use that term and discuss modernity. And so we will get to that in a minute, but I'll open us with prayer. Father, we ask and pray in this moment that you would just be with us. Lord, I thank you for, at minimum, the exercise that this class has been for Kyle and I in discussing and tracking and understanding how it is that we, Mosaic, a church, have gotten here, Lord, and opening our minds to that and seeing the way your goodness and your mercy has pervaded and how you have chose to use the people that you created to reveal yourself and to allow thought and idea to progress and to happen, God. So we just ask and pray tonight as we discuss this and as our final night that you would bless us and be with us. Allow us to learn and grow as we understand more about you and us as your people. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so 1750-ish to today. The Reformation really hit its peak shortly after Luther, as Kyle talked about. So we're in Luther's happening in the 1500s. That Reformation idea kind of continues, and it's really reached its end or conclusion by the late 1700s. As it has been with this whole class, and the idea, if you would track Christian thought, is it is not a clean and hard line. And this is true of all of history, right? Like you talk about different historical ideas or concepts, and there's not necessarily, we say the civil rights movement, and we probably all think of the 60s, but yet we know that there was stuff going on before, and there is still stuff continuing to go on. And so this is just true. There's never this hard line. But we're looking at roughly 1750 to the modern times of today. And we're going to talk about the term or the theological word, and I think even the historical word, outside of Christian thought for this era would be modernity, and that is modern. But that's a hard word to define, just as a lot of these other words are, because if you and I were to talk about modern technology or modern understanding, what we would mean by that is right now, the most recent is the way modern would be used in that sense. When we're talking about the modern era, we're really talking about late 1700s to early to mid 1900s. And again, there's not a hard line there. So two terms that may be helpful in thinking of the modern era that would be a little bit more generous possibly would be Enlightenment and Post-Enlightenment, because we're going to talk about modernity and post-modernity, which many of you are probably familiar with the idea of postmodern art or postmodern literature. There's also postmodern philosophical thought. And what we're talking about there is post-modernity. Something to highlight that defines this era, whether it is the modern or postmodern era, is that we are shifting the central or the locus of Christian thought is moving from Europe to the United States. I would say North America, but it's really the United States. So that starts to happen a little bit in the 1700s. You get guys like Jonathan Edwards, and then you get the Wesley brothers, and Wesleyanism, Methodism, and all of that starts happening then. The revivalist movement of America, and as America develops, those guys are there, they're a part of it, and it progresses and it moves, and as America becomes the predominant world power, if you will, and that moves away from Europe, then what you have is the Christian thought and idea moves away from being centered in Europe. Specifically, what you can track from really the 1500s and even just before the 1500s up until probably the early 1900s, 20th century, is the theological power and prowess is located in Germany. Yeah, that's where Martin Luther is, or German-speaking Germanic countries, if you will, in the surrounding area. So you get Germany and the Lutheran movement and all of that. There is some stuff like we talked about last week happening in England in the English Reformation, and there are some great theologians that come out of that. But like your theological powerhouses, if you will, largely reside in Germany up until the early 20th century, 1900s. So this is a good thing in some sense, right? Because when you move out of a very centered place, what was and still is, if you've traveled around Europe, it is still a very monolithic culture in a lot of ways, especially Germany and some of those like Eastern European countries. And so there's not quite as much of the diversity of thought and cultures because you don't see the same immigration happening there, where in America that is supposed to be one of our defining characteristics. As we know recently, that is something we are challenging as a nation. But at the beginning, that is like something that's very core and central. So you have Germans and Irish and English and French all kind of developing these thoughts with one another. And so you have a little bit of a globalization to Christian thought and idea, to Christian theology. And that happens largely like, or even more outside of North America in this time. And that's a cool thing. As the world becomes more global, the globalization of Christian thought happens. And there are now theologians and popes that exist from outside of the European continent. And so that's happening in Protestantism, it's happening in Catholicism. And so you see this, and this is a good thing. I would also contend, whether you want to call it good, bad, or indifferent, as I often like to say, that we see the most of this still coming out of the United States. And I say that to just simply say this, and that is that whether you think that's good or bad, it's worth noting that much of the trend of Christian thought since probably the early to mid 1800s, definitely since the 20th century into now, the last 125 years, what we will often be debating and talking about in terms of Christianity is a very, very small view of Christianity, and is a very young idea of Christianity, and it is also inescapably tied up into the progress of the United States. And so that's helpful to kind of tease that out. That is not all bad. Don't hear me say that that's all terrible. I think that I would be tempted, and in a more casual conversation, I would maybe jokingly say that's worse than it probably is, because that would be my inclination, was to sort of be like, oh, this is all terrible. It's American theology. But it is just to say that a lot of our thoughts and understanding of what theology is and what Christianity is really tied to a view that's only 125 years old. So when you put that into juxtaposition of the fact that Christianity, where we sit today, is 2,100 years old for the most part, and then you think about the roots of our faith, we are a Judeo-Christian faith. So as we understand Judaism, let's just go back to the establishment of Jerusalem and King David and all of that. We're talking about a faith that is, it'd be more than 1,100. If we're talking 1,700 years post-Jesus, we're going back another 9,000 to 10,000 years to King David. And then we've got Moses and a long tradition of Judaism that is established before that. So we're looking at something that really has strong roots of about 16,000 years. And most of what we spend our time debating and discussing is 125 years of that 16,000. Now, that's because that's the 125 years that we're most influenced and shaped by. So it would be natural for us to talk about these things. But I just want to bring a note to that, because I find that really helpful when I'm wrestling through these things, to think about some of what we're processing really is only about 50 years old. I'm going to come back to a point at the end of this that will kind of be an experiment on that same side, to understand how so many of the things that we think are Christian faith, that's it, oh, this is what it means to be a Christian, a lot of times are very much influenced and shaped by the last 50 to 75 years of development as an American nation and as Western modernized technological civilization has expanded. But we're going to start in the 1800s and we're going to end there. Well, really, we're going to start slightly into the 1700s. Like I said, that's when Jonathan Edwards is moving over. What is happening in the 18th century is a movement towards valuing reason above all else. Now, the Middle Ages, Reformation era, they would have also valued reason. You may have heard the Enlightenment. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but the age of reason is sometimes what we'll call the Enlightenment or the start of the modern era. And that is not to say that everything was beyond, or that up until that no one valued reason or things weren't reasonable. In fact, you can see and track through there that in the 1800s and 1900s, there's a lot of like things that are outside of reason that gain traction and take place. What we're saying when we call this the age of reason, or that we articulate that they value reason above all else, is that there's a push to use human reason to understand the world and its mysteries. So up until this point, think about like science, the scientific revolution that happens, modern medicine. Like this is where this is all starting to really take off. And so up until this point, there was a lot of mystery in life, and people just kind of accepted it for what they were. And there's a lot of superstition that is tied into some of these religious ideas. And even looking back, like we were talking before the class started about how Leviticus and some of these ideas, like there's some things tied into there that were like really modern and progressive for them that now we would see as like almost superstitious. In Christianity and Christian thought, or Jewish thought, in some senses always kind of using that to reveal to us who God is, but to move his people forward into something else. I believe in continued revelation, and so that's a stance at Mosaic, that we would say that God is always revealing himself, but he uses where we're at to do so. And so there is this thing where what begins to happen is that they want to challenge and push back to mystery, to not skepticism. They become skeptical of our kind of pre-assumed notions of how the world works. And what they want to say is that we can use human reason and intellect to explain everything. This is really important to understand because all of us are products of this way of thinking and like this way of being educated. We are all, no matter how much you want to push back on modernity and the Enlightenment or even post-modernity, we're all products of it. This is the way we are educated, is to think and to process this way. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight, and I'll interject at different points here as well, like it's going to be like, well, of course that's the way, like of course human reason is how we understand and judge things. Like of course science explains things. Of course, the stars, if you just saw Luca, they're not fish in the sky, right? Like they're stars. Like they can understand that. And like you see some of that like superstitious stuff like in myths and all of that. Like that's how they explain so much of their stuff. And so there's this push to say we can understand these things at a deeper and more honest intellectual level. So also what we see them do is that like in this, they begin to try to value reason over it, but they want to say that Christian faith can be understood with human reason. What we're about to do is an extremely this is a quick flyover of the next 250 years. If you could teach an entire semester on the Reformation, you could probably teach an entire 2 or 3 semesters just on some of the things like that we're going to name as topics and then move on. Liberation theology, feminist movement in theology, black theology. These are all things that just develop really from like 1950 on. So if I don't give a whole ton of weight to the Enlightenment, you can raise your hand, ask questions, we can talk, debate, do things like that. But we're going to move pretty quick. And that way too, we're not here for, 2.5 hours or anything crazy like that. So the Enlightenment then has a huge effect on Christianity. That reason being is that all of the people that are like dipping their toes and beginning to process the Enlightenment and that are founders of the Enlightenment in the modern era, they're all believers. They're all Christians for the most part. And like societally speaking, culturally speaking, everywhere these places are coming from are still mostly Christian cultures and societies. Like what Kyle referenced a couple weeks ago about Christendom, like that is still the case. Like culture and society, thought, school, all of that, like everywhere you would go, it would be reminiscent of what we grew up with for me, rural Midwest America, for you guys here in the South. Like Christian culture is just assumed. Everyone seems to be, mostly you would meet someone and that would just be the basis at which you operated from. And they may not go to church or whatever, but like you would have just assumed everybody had some sort of belief in something. And the Enlightenment is when that really starts to change. And now we know and interact and like come into contact with much more people, especially if you've dealt with Europe or Pacific Northwest here in the United States. Southeast, Midwest are kind of the last to make that change. But we're still very much in a Christian culture, and we are in Christendom at its finest. And so they want to take Christendom and they want to hold it up to human reason and to human logic. And what they want to say is that Christianity is a rational religion and that it can be proven by human rationale and reason. That to you guys and to me at times may not seem like that's a bad endeavor to set out on. And I think if I am guilty of something in terms of being a product of my times and of my education and of my own story, I think that I at times can probably try too hard and lean too heavy on this idea of Christianity being a natural, human, logical, reasonable thing. And I spend a lot of my time trying to make sense of things and make it make sense to me, right? And I would say that most of us do the same thing because, again, we are products of the Enlightenment. We need things to make sense to us and to be reasonable. Just to throw some names out along the way, I've read most of these guys, maybe just bits and pieces, but this idea is something that you would find very, very prevalent in John Locke. Not the character from Lost, but the character that the guy from Lost is named after. If you are not a Lost fan, do yourself a favor and watch it. But there is this idea that human thought can explain Christianity and that Christianity is a rational, reasonable thing to believe in. Like I said, this is mostly good, but the problem with that is that then we begin to remove altogether the idea or even the need for divine revelation. And so when you start to remove the idea of divine revelation from being a believer, then you start to remove this idea that God can and desires to interact and to speak to us and to be a part of what we're doing. And you also begin to chip away at and remove the idea of mystery and of like the miraculous and the supernatural and the metaphysical. And so all of these things start to begin to be questioned at a really, really deep level. So in a push to understand Christianity as a rational and reasonable thing, they begin to minimize altogether this idea of revelation and of the mystical. For some people and for some minds, we would probably say, well, that's a good thing, right? But along with that is a push then to begin to explain away different aspects of how we see and understand who Jesus is and what we have in the story of the Scriptures. So, reason begins to become elevated above revelation. And then in that, what we do is we move to what would be called critical theory or critical understanding of how we read and interpret Scripture. Again, most of us would be somewhat familiar with this theory or this idea because we kind of read Scripture this way. We read it critically. We examine it. We want to know where it came from. We want to get at the author's original intent. We want to understand what they were doing. And we want to know if it's true or not, right? Like we start to think of how did this historically happen? Was this is this reliable? Is this trustworthy? And so all of that kind of comes from this movement towards rationality and critical thinking. I can't mention critical theory and understanding without mentioning something that would be called the historical Jesus movement. So this group of people begins to examine Scripture, begins to look at it from this rational, reasonable perspective, and what they want to say then is we have to get to the historical Jesus. Not the Jesus that we have been told about with all of the myth and all of the superstition surrounding it, because those were irrational and unenlightened minds. But we, being rational and enlightened, we know that there is a historical Jesus behind the Jesus we read of in Scriptures. So they would begin to have these meetings where they would get together, and this is still going on today, and there's still movements of this. And what they want to say is like, yeah, we know that that's what those people back then wrote, but they didn't know about the world the way we did. They didn't know about science and technology and medicine and space and astronomy and like all of these things. And so they would say that then there's someone behind that is we should see and we should know and we should follow. The problem with that, and this is where Enlightenment's train tracks begin to fall apart, or you could say the train begins to come off the tracks, whatever analogy you want to use with that, is that in an attempt to move to this, in an attempt to see a historical Jesus, what you then begin to have is all of the supernatural aspects of Christ and His divinity begin to get pulled away. So you would rightly guess that these people would have a lot of struggle, or like they would really find it difficult to make statements like, we believe in Jesus and that like He is the Son, that He's God equal. The Trinity starts to fall apart. But what also starts to fall apart is Jesus' atoning death. And now there's lots of atonement theories, and we've articulated that in new ways. And there are things called Neo-Orthodoxy that are happening now later that like will use some of this Enlightenment theory to go back to an understanding of what was before the Enlightenment. But you start to see questionings of the miraculous in that sense. So there's no resurrection. They wouldn't be able to understand resurrection. They would explain that away. They would explain Jesus' death as God away. That wouldn't be real to them. So you really start to chop at orthodoxy in huge ways here. Because what Jesus becomes to them, the historical Jesus, is a good, moral, logical, reasonable teacher. And so if we remove the resurrection and the redemption of humanity, and you start to pull all of these bricks out, what you're left with is Jesus as just a nice philosophical and moral educator. And so that they're good, they don't want to take the good away from Him, and they don't want to take some of His teachings away, but they then don't want to accept Jesus as Messiah. And so there are people that would say this line of thinking or thought would be that they want the king, but they don't want the kingdom. They want to separate Jesus from the kingdom of God in this understanding and this idea. So what then happens is we have a view of humanity that then starts to challenge ideas of original sin, because we have this individualized understanding of humanity. We're actually pretty good. We're not that terrible. We're pretty good people. We're smart. We're able to think. We're able to reason. We value that over divine revelation, so we really don't then need divine or any kind of mystical experience or intervention. We've got this on our own. And then the problem of evil gets entered into the picture. So then through the Enlightenment is really how we have what I would call existentialism in a lot of ways. Because we're then beginning to wonder where we're from, how did this all happen? If we're logical, reasonable human beings, and we don't need all of that mysticism and superstition, and we're mostly good people, well, where does evil come from then? Because also what we're eliminating is Jesus' atoning death on the cross. Because there's no need for that. Because all the cross becomes is this really devout form of commitment and loyalty and self-sacrifice. And we, being good people and followers of Jesus, just need to also be really good, self-sacrificing, committed, and loyal people. And that's all it is. We would say that we want to replicate that of Jesus being true, but we think that the cross is more than that. We think his teachings are more than just moral ideas or good ideas, but we think that it is God himself speaking and moving in and through us, and allowing us to step into something more. So that sort of gets us into the first section. That is like Enlightenment at its finest, kind of blows up and it goes. Questions, comments, concerns? Yes.
Some of the things that you're describing that members of the historical Jesus movement believe, or perhaps this is just the way you were framing the historical context, but like, or consider, maybe you have to throw it away, but consider, seem pretty. Do I need to start my question over?
No, you're going.
Okay.
Keep going.
Seem pretty fundamental to my understanding of Christianity.
Okay.
So would members of that movement refer to themselves as Christians?
Yes, they would. But explain more, because I think you're getting to the point that I'm talking about. Explain more of like why, like what about the historical Jesus movement seems pretty fundamental to your understandings of Christianity?
Or the things they omit, like literal death and resurrection of Jesus.
Oh, okay. I see. I'm sorry. I misunderstood your statement there. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. But keep going.
I'm having trouble thinking of another example off
Yeah.
the top of my head. But that made me wonder, like, do they still consider themselves Christians, or is it kind of like, are they people who started out as Christians and they say, actually, Jesus was just a guy, and you can listen to him if you want, but we're not really Christians? Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. Sorry, I misunderstood that small statement there. I would say yes, that there are multitudes of them that would still consider themselves Christians. I thought about this a lot when I was preaching on Sunday. Like I try to always think of people that would hold positions different than me and like how they would read or interpret a passage. And thinking through something like 1 Corinthians 8, like I wouldn't be surprised if someone that it was in the historical Jesus movement or other like more kind of like post-liberal theological camps or like liberal theological camps that we see that are a development of this, that they would probably read something like 1 Corinthians 8 and see themselves as the stronger ones, and that like we in our weak conscience, we still need some of the myth, and we still need, and I don't know if that's true or not, like I'm just like kind of guessing here, but I wouldn't be surprised if they would kind of be like, oh yeah, like one day you'll see what I know. Like one day you'll have the knowledge and the understanding that I do. Now there are people that are more conservative that have that same line of argument, and so that's why I'm like, well, I don't think that can sort of sometimes make me go like, well, is that true? Like, have I just held on to something? And am I the younger, weaker, conscious one here? Like, and I'm willing to submit that before others in the Lord and pray through that and process that and continue to engage those ideas. I don't think so, but it would be, arrogant of me to not at least like open-handedly present that before someone in the Lord. So I think that they would consider themselves Christians. Yes, a lot of them. And I think that we would find some of the people, like I'm painting with really broad brushstrokes and like kind of like where it ended up. There's levels to this, like there always are. And so I think a lot of the people would agree with a lot more of us than we would care to, or would initially probably admit. I shouldn't say care to admit. I think we need to take care to admit that there are really good things, just like I will defend some good things that we get from Evangelicism despite all of its flaws and characters. There are also really good things from this movement that we do get that like you and I would believe and hold on to. We just don't want to omit, as you said, the same things that they do that are core to the Christian faith. But they do some good work for us, and I think that they are really helpful. And critical reading of the Bible is not a bad thing. And it's been helpful to engage with those people that are wrestling with those ideas and those theologies. And so, yeah, I think they would continue to consider themselves a people of the book, as we would, and followers of Jesus. They would just have some real different theories of atonement. But there's a wide view of that in Christianity as it is today. Okay, so also what you start to lose in the Enlightenment, if you're pulling out the divine, or I shouldn't say you're pulling out the divine, they would just understand the divine differently. They would want to say that like natural religion or natural theology would be a way that you could maybe talk about this. Like that there's a truth that exists in the world and that Christianity is getting at that. And the parts that don't align with this like kind of natural, reasonable truth of Christianity are excess, or they belong to, I think that they would probably call it superstition or like sort of archaic, outdated understandings that are still tied. So that's why they read Scripture the way they do. But what you also begin to lose in that is you begin to lose a sense of mystery and wonder. And now this doesn't just happen within the church, because there's a whole movement that comes out of the Enlightenment that we would call like the Romantics or like Romanticism, that is a push back to, and they have their own issues with the church, like the Romantic period, like they've got their own problems, or this new Romantic period, I guess I should say, but like the Romantics that come out of the Enlightenment, they have their own issues with the church, but they also have their issues with this like insistence upon reason above all else. And I think they would probably say that it's a cold or an emotionally or experientially bankrupt way of living. There's no, just being or just existing. And there's no mystery to life. There's no awe to life, because we know these kind of cold, this is pejorative, but like, the stereotype of the cold, calculated, scientific person that just is like, food is fuel, why enjoy it? Like, it just is making my body work. Like, sleep is a necessary evil. Like, and I'm thinking of like Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory, like they're always trying to like, hey man, have fun. And he's like, well, like there's a reason for everything. And so they begin to push back on this, and they want to like reimagine or re-envision mystery and awe in the world again. And so that is a secular critique or a secular movement that's happening, and it's also a Christian movement that's happening to the secular movement and Christian movement of the Enlightenment. And so like you do see that, and I think that we have probably tried to recapture some of that as mosaic of like, what does it look like to have mystery? And something like we want to understand and explain, but like we also want to be caught up in the beauty of the world. And I think Christianity eventually ends up moving that direction to some degree, and I think that that's a good thing. So that's happening. The Enlightenment's happening. We're tearing everything down. We're kind of, questioning everything, because if it can't be reasonable or if it can't be understood. And so then what begins to happen in Europe specifically, I guess this would be, I think I have dates written down on this. We're looking at like mid-1800s here, where there begins to be a movement that questions society as a religious thing. And so this is where we really start to move into what we would call like a secular society. And so this is the death of Christendom. Post-Enlightenment. The Enlightenment starts out as a Christian movement to understand Christianity as a reasonable thing, and to understand it from a natural standpoint and to defend it. And then what you end up with is really kind of like the destruction of Christianity as a cultural or a societal norm. If you know Christendom and you understand it, that's maybe not a bad thing. And so again, what I would want to say is that this like Enlightenment thing, though it doesn't do, like there's a lot of holes in it, it does some things that I don't necessarily think are bad. Because this is not a full-blown Reformation. But if you track church history, as we have, every few hundred years there's kind of a monumental shift, and there's things that happen up to that. And I've contended for some time, and I'm not a PhD in historical theology or anything like that, and so this is just my musings. But I often wonder if we currently now here in the 21st century aren't experiencing some sort of reformation of the church. And I'm sure other people have thought that before, and historically they look back and like, that wasn't the case. But I actually don't know if the death of Christendom as we know it and being a predominantly Christian society is necessarily a bad thing. And so you begin to see this happening in Europe, specifically England, and like as a result of like English art and a philosophical idea that there is a death of or a ending to faith as like kind of the societal norm or cultural norm. And so we begin to move into, in the modern era, what would be post-Christian or post-Christendom. That has been going on in Europe for probably 100 or so years now. It is moving through all kind of Western thought and society. Again, I said this earlier, like if you're in New York City, Pacific Northwest, there are little pockets in the United States where that's starting to happen in the last 30, 40 years. You can go back into the 80s. I think you're even starting to see it happen in Birmingham, Alabama. I'm not hand-wringing about that. Like, I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think it's exposing some of the problems and faults that have existed when, like, that has just kind of been assumed and we've just sort of went along with that. And we'll see that sort of play out, I think, in the way that, like, some of the Protestant movements have gone the directions they have in the last 25, 50 years. Like, I think we're seeing that come to fruition now. The tie to Christianity and American ideals, and some of that I was talking about. And so I wonder, I'm not saying we are, I'm not a prophet standing up and saying this is the third or fourth Reformation that we find ourselves in, like depending on if you want to count Jesus and moving from Judaism, but like you do see this happening. And so this happens first in England. There's a crisis of faith. And what at the heart of this, what they kind of move to, and you guys will be really familiar with these arguments and thoughts now, is that they want to contend that there is a moral good that you can take from faith and religion and Christianity that people have often described like, oh, well, that's like, this is the way. If you want to be a moral, ethical character, you have to do these things. And they want to contend and say you can take that moral good without the metaphysical ideas of a God and of this divine purpose, existence that you fall into. And so they begin to separate that, the aspects of faith and specifically of Christianity. And this really is the formation, or what we would call like the roots of humanism, of like, oh, well, that's like, it's all located in humanity and there is no divine or otherness. Like it's us and what we have here, and like it's on us to be good. And in that, there are, again, good Christian thought, and I learned from people, I think, as that movement has expanded and has gone on. That's not to say that it's totally terrible. Like, I think that there are ways that you and I would talk about Christianity, and that there are ways that we would, like, understand and articulate what is happening in the church with some humanistic ways. And that would make some people really, really uncomfortable to, like, even hear me say that. But I'm not saying we're humanistic at Mosaic. I'm just saying that, like, I think some of that is okay. Like, that is culture progressing to some degree, or thought moving along and changing and ebbing and flowing, and the Lord revealing himself in that. Because where truth is to be found, I think the Lord is to be found, and that sometimes is found in these other ideas, and the Lord wants to use that to speak. That's what we see in the Old Testament. He's using things and ideas and philosophical ideas to reveal himself to his people. And so I think we see some of that happening in modernity and as we move into post-modernity. But this is definitely where we get to the point of like now, so that is sort of the end of what we would call the modern era. And like that is like, because the Enlightenment has sort of ran its course to some degree at that point. You can argue we're still in like a little bit of the Enlightenment era. Again, these things aren't hard and fast. If modernity is a hard word to define, when does it end and when are we in post-modernity and when does post-modernism actually begin? You know, like there's debate on this. But so it kind of runs its course in Europe especially. We move into a crisis of faith. We're post-Christendom in Europe. It's happening now in America. And I would say for the most part, we're post-Christian in America at this point. I don't think the assumption is any longer that people are a follower of Jesus or of God, really. that's now kind of for someone to define for themselves. So that ends that. And now we would move into what is postmodern. So let me pause here. And I should say that some of this should start to feel really obvious to you. And I think in some ways, some of these critiques might feel, at least for me, they feel difficult at times. Of like, I kind of feel like you start to get into these uneasiness because I start to say things like, well, but I do want to be able to say that. Like you start to understand some of these human ideas and morals and ethics that can exist in humanity that are separate from a metaphysical idea. Like we do want to say that some of that has to be somewhat true, because we've all met really good people that don't follow Jesus, and they're really kind and caring and loving, and it would be pejorative to say that they're all evil and like terrible just because they don't come to church on a Sunday morning. Like we know that's not true. We want to say things like we want to be able to trust the Bible, and we talked about some of that. So I think that there, in some ways, it can be difficult to kind of go like, where is that line in this? And I think some of this feels really natural to like think this way because, again, these are the streams we swim in. We are an enlightened group of people, and we are products of the Enlightenment in that sense. We are educated by an Enlightenment system or a modern system, even postmodern, depending on what kind of school you would have went to, or like a modern understanding of liberal arts ideas and things like that. Like a lot of us are educated in a postmodern framework of the world. And so as we get into postmodernism, I think that we'll understand that even more so. But I think it would be natural if some of this was like, this is where there starts to be some tension. Like Reformation ideas and Martin Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the Catholic Church door because of indulgences and a critique of some of those things and like how that progressed, you go, well, of course. Like, he needed to do that. But we're 500 years removed, and I think that we can then be gracious to some of those folks, that as we discuss and wrestle with things that we're currently in, like it would have been natural to be like, well, that's why they didn't see it. Because like it's just, to them, that's the way it had always been. Because for us, even though it's only 100 or 200 years old in Christian thought, it's just the way it's always been. That's just the way we see the world. We see it with a telescope now instead of eyes of myth and legend, you know? Like, we know what is out there. We know how the world exists. And so, like, we just see it differently. And so I think it can be hard and difficult. So let's pause here for 1 second. Questions, comments? Anything? It's okay if you don't. So we'll say this. We've had the Enlightenment, and we begin to have a crisis of faith. Society and culture is moving post-Christendom. We're moving, you could even say like post-religious. Science, reason, truth in a definable manner is beginning to be valued above all else. There is some pushback that begins to happen to that, where we want to value awe and wonder and beauty, because the Enlightenment kind of wants to put everything as like logical and orderly, and we want to say that there is a place where things can kind of be open and not so sterile. And so then that is where we move into postmodernism. Postmodernism, I would define it as this. It's a loose term, but I would say that it is the idea that there are no absolutes. There are no fixed certainties or like any sort of general or universal foundations in which we share. It is a distrust of meta-narratives, and what I mean by that is it is a distrust of grand or large or encompassing narratives that attempt to give some sort of universal explanation of how or why we are what we are or how we exist. Because what they would want to say in postmodernism, and what I would be tempted to say sometimes too, because I am very, very much a product of postmodernism. And in the way my mind works, I resonate with a lot of this. But it would be this idea that like all of our experiences are our own. And so this begins to be where you see that the idea that like in a text, like a postmodern reading of something or a postmodern listening to music, is that there is no universal meaning to anything. Because what they would argue is that there is no way in which an author or an artist could ever perfectly convey meaning in what they do, because they don't understand the lens in which you're going to interpret it through. And so it is impossible for them to ever put the meaning that they intend into the work that they create, because you are going to interpret it, and ultimately what you receive on your end is the thing that is communicated. And so like whatever you receive is what you received, and that's the meaning of the thing for you. But for me, I could get something else out of that. In their own language, I guess, in my reading for this tonight, they talked about that there are signals and signifiers, and communication is in some sense the unity of the two. And up until this point, the signal itself was where we considered the loci of meaning, like the centrality of meaning was in the signal. But like what they begin to flip is it's the reader or the viewer of the signal. And so as that gets unified, it gets flipped. And so then it's all up to your interpretation. In postmodernism, there is a distrust of any kind of like norms that you want to put on anything. So you naturally kind of understand how we would get into this space where like postmodern art is art that like anything can be art. This is the guy that sits on a toilet. I'm thinking of like some of the things you've maybe seen like Shia LaBeouf do on the internet, where he like put himself in a glass cage in Times Square and just was like in this glass box. I think it was in Times Square. Maybe it was in an art museum, but like that's art, because like anything, and there's no definition to things anymore. And so I think if you see that as a pushback to Enlightenment, that makes sense. Like this kind of over definition, everything's got to be logical, everything's got to be reasonable. It's all science and math. It's all about explanation and understanding. And culturally, there's just this giant push to go, well, no, we don't have to explain everything. And things can just be what they want to be, and we can just make, like, it's all about the interpreter. There's no absolute truth. So in that, then, there is a built-in commitment to relativism and pluralism. And these are huge streams and moves that, like, only happen in the last 7,500 years, that, like, someone would kind of begin to see, like, pluralism. And when I say pluralism, what I mean that is in, like, a religious sense. That, like, all religion is equal and good, because they're all trying to get at something, and they're all trying to understand something. And so in some sense, in postmodernism, you see, like, modernity and Enlightenment brings a rise to atheism. So think like Nietzsche, like in his works and his writings. And then, I mean, you still have atheism in postmodernity, but like you really move into this idea that like, well, you could be an atheist, I could be an agnostic, you could be a Christian, but we're like, that's because that's where we were born, it's our view of the world, it's our understanding. And so it's really postmodernity in this understanding of like things not having a central or core meaning, and everything being interpretable to your own view and understanding, that gives rise to something like pluralism. Or another thing that has more recently come into vogue is like what they would call parallelism, which is pluralism, but they want to say that like your expression of your religion does matter, but like we're all trying to get to the same place. So maybe a good example of parallelism would be the elephant theory. I don't know if you guys have ever heard this, that all religions are grasping at an elephant. And if you have the leg and I have the trunk and Glenna has the ear, like we would all be describing something different because we're at a different place on it. But we're all just trying to describe the elephant. And so like we value and respect the fact that you would articulate it in your own way, where universalism or pluralism would sort of say like, it would be one, we all have a view of the elephant, but there would be multiple ways to describe the elephant. And so it begins to kind of like devalue each individual religion's like distinctives and they kind of want to say like your distinctives aren't all that important. But like it's fine that you worship that way. Parallelism would want to uphold the distinctives and like what makes each religion separate from one another. But the goal is the same, to say that like it's still just your interpretation or understanding of it. So that gives rise in the 1900s, and that's sort of postmodernism where we are today. So as we talk about that, I think we have to mention just a few things as we talk about this, and that is, let's think about it this way. You see 1000, so this is where I'm going to talk about like the every 500 years. So you're in like Christianity happens year 0, but not really, more like year 36. But then 300, 400 years later, you really get Rome and like Christendom at its finest. Constantine makes it an official religion in the 300s. Takes a few years for it to become what it becomes. Then that is the way Christianity sort of exists for the next 600-700 years. Then in the mid 1000s, whatever you want to call it, 1000s, the mid thousands, you get the Great Schism, which is when the East and the West splits. So then you get the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. That exists for about 500 years, and then in the 1500s, you get the Protestant Reformation. That takes about 200 years to settle itself, and then from like 17, probably a little bit earlier than, probably like late 1600s, after the Protestant Reformation is really kind of, the dust has settled, the next movement in the church that you see happen is this explosion of denominations. And it's like a branch, you can call it a splintering if you want to sort of speak of it more negatively, or you can call it like a branching out if you want to be more neutral on it. But that is, I think, what defines from the church standpoint. So we're tracking philosophical thought and kind of how Christendom drops off in secular age and secular thought, which is what we're in. We are in the secular age, is what I would say. Whether that, is a Christian society in Birmingham or not. So we're in the secular age, but what's happening alongside of that is the church has branched out, and we have denominations everywhere. And Kyle spoke a little bit about this when he did the Reformation, because he said it's natural. If one of the things that you hold on to in the Reformation is that you're always reforming, then it would be natural that all these different like sects, if you will, branches, ideas would split. And that is a good thing in some sense. And then if you think about it, it also makes sense that this would be happening in a modern and postmodern society, right? As we begin to expand on these things, we begin to explore them, we begin to find reason and understanding, and you're able to interpret things yourself. Like, we can't separate the two things totally. So like post-modernity is happening secularly, it's got a lot of critiques on Christianity, but then like the ability for me to look at a Presbyterian and say to them, like, oh, I totally get why you would think that, and that's cool that you worship that way, but I'm going to worship this way. Like, that's a product of post-modernity in a lot of senses. So, or the end of modernity. Like, we don't get there without that movement. So we have all these denominations. There are two major movements in the 1900s. So you have like the mainline Protestant denominations, Methodism, Lutheranism, Anglicanism. Those are the three that really come out of, and the Anabaptists, if you want to give a fourth one. Kyle talked about that some last week as well. Those are like the kind of four main religions that come out of the Protestant Reformation. And then now we have, all the subsets of that. There's like three different Presbyterians, and that was Calvin, Luther. Anglicanism is the English Reformation. Methodist is the Wesley brothers coming over to America. And so those are kind of the four mainline denominations that we see. There are, give or take some more. But you see those start to split and break apart in the 1900s. But two movements that really happen in the 1900s that are affecting those mainline denominational splits, as well as like becoming their own denominations in some right, is Evangelicism, which really isn't a major thought or idea until like the 1920s as we know it and understand it. And I'm going to define that in just a second to differentiate between what is culturally understood as evangelicism and what is the stream of theological thought and idea that initially was called evangelicism. And those are two different things, and it's worth noting because some churches may still call themselves evangelical, and they would not be filled with the people that show up in the evangelical vote, if you get my drift. So, evangelicism is one stream, and then the other stream, late 1800s, early 1900s, is Pentecostalism or charismatic. And so that is kind of tied into a pushback to Enlightenment in that same movement of like there being some mystery to the world and mysticism, and that the Holy Spirit would move and would encounter, and that there is some interaction between the physical and the metaphysical and the divine and the creatureliness of us, that like the Lord still speaks and moves and operates within us. So those are the two big movements. Those kind of tied together, and in the last 30 years, what we've really experienced, not even 30, last 20 years, is what I would call the rise of network Christianity. And there's a book by that title, and those are largely out of those two streams. And what you see in the rise of network Christianity is this movement that is rooted in evangelicism or charismatic movement. It's rooted in this branching out of denominations, and basically it's an abandonment of the like denominational ties or following something back to one central place of authority or power, and it is a move of church growth that happens centered more or less around one person. And you can honestly track that back to probably like the 1960s, 1970s. I do not blame Billy Graham for it, but it is sort of like Billy Graham's evangelical movement happens, and he's doing that traveling around. And people begin to kind of say, like, well, if that's not a denomination and we can all go back to Billy Graham, then like we could kind of do that on a local level. A lot of people that track these things will track it back to a guy named Robert Schuller, which is the Crystal Cathedral in California, and he was the one that had a TV show called The Hour of Power. And it's really the birth of televangelism, and these like movements being built around one personality. And now we live in a city that is like, full, like there literally is ARC network here. And I'm not trying to critique that or say positives or negative things about it. It's just to say like that's now the world we live in churches. That coincides with the growth and the explosion of the suburbs, and like this idea that bigger and better is like good and we want that. And so, like, it's not to say that they did something terrible. It's just to say, like, 20 years ago, there were a few hundred mega churches, and now there are thousands and thousands. And they are these, like, replicable, franchisable almost things that are happening. And a lot of that is born out of what we see in terms of the branching of denominations. And so I think that gets us sort of to our cultural moment the best. So let me say this about evangelicism. I'm going to read something here. There are kind of four theological thoughts or ideas that we see in evangelicism. It's the authority and the sufficiency of Scripture, and Mosaic would align with that. We would say we are people of the book, and we believe in the authority of Scripture. It is the uniqueness of redemption through the death of Christ upon the cross. We would also believe that. We have different atonement theories than some other people that maybe we're more familiar with. But like we do believe that there is an atoning moment that is happening, and that there is something salvific about the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. We would believe in the need for personal conversion. We may be a little bothered by that specific language, but we're articulating the same thing. I would say we believe in the need of an individual decision to practice the way of resurrection and following Jesus. That there is something to that. I believe you do it communally, and we can overemphasize the individual aspect of that. But there is a need for a declaration of faith, whether that be baptism or confirmation, whatever stream you're swimming in. But there is a moment where you say, I have decided to follow Jesus, to quote the old hymn. And that there is a necessity, propriety, and urgency to bring others into the kingdom, or what they would call evangelism, which is where the name comes from. That there is a need to bring people into the good life and the abundant life of the kingdom of God, is the way I would word that. Others might focus more on the idea of damnation and hell and, really focus on these ideas of like, we got to save the souls. Ultimately, I think that is the case, but I don't think of it in that same kind of like way. Like, we want to invite people into the life of the kingdom. So theologically, you could articulate that Mosaic is evangelical. Culturally, or how the word has become to be known, there is nothing on our website or in our writing, or you will never hear me and Kyle describe us as an evangelical church. Because, especially in a city like Birmingham, Alabama, that word has just become to mean so much that it is something that we would rather not have to like fight that battle, so we just don't use it. But so theologically, we are evangelical. This movement happens, and this is where the Billy Graham type crusades and this push to win souls over for Jesus begin to happen. It starts to get really weird in like the 1970s when a very new idea becomes, I shouldn't say new idea, a very marginalized idea becomes very popular when we begin to talk about something like the rapture. So this idea that Jesus is going to come back any day and he's just going to swoop up everybody that's a believer and take them to heaven, and then the rest of the world is going to be left to fend for itself. And so that there is tied then to a lot of this evangelical movement, some stuff that happens. And we can get into what would be eschatology if you want to, and if you have questions on that. But just to like remind you, the rapture, as most of us have read about it or seen it in movies, thanks Nicolas Cage and who's the dude from Growing Pains that did the first one that was real bad? I can't think of his name. Anyways, there's a Christian movie from the Left Behind books and that kind of cultural phenomenon. And this idea that two people are just going to be walking down the road and one's just going to disappear and cars are going to crash, and this whole kind of post-apocalyptic idea that Jesus would just swoop everybody out of earth. That's like a 30-year-old theology, and honestly I would say it's mostly already on its way out. There are roots to it. That's not to say that but the idea and the way we understand it and the way I was raised to believe it and know it, when I was taught it, it was probably 17, 18 years old. I'll tell a funny story. My mom, one time my sister was a young girl, 3, 4 years old, and she was playing hide and seek, and she was kind of at that phase where she didn't really need naps anymore, and she crawled behind a couch and fell asleep, and my mom couldn't find her, and she kept calling her name. This would have been late 80s, and my mom literally sat down and started crying because she was convinced that the rapture had happened. And like those were the streams that a lot of people were swimming in when I was in faith in the 90s. Like that's a big, if you're a child of the 90s, like those ideas were not uncommon. So that is a very new or kind of recent development in Christian thought. So I'll pause for questions in just a second, but I want to say this too. We need to think about the fact that we talk about Christianity being on the decline, and that we talk about Christianity kind of like dwindling in numbers and in popularity. That is specifically, though, as Post-Modernism has developed and we see we're moving into a post-secular society, and I was saying that tonight, but that's through a lens of the Western culture that we are a part of. Simultaneously, in the last few hundred years, what we have seen really in the last 150 years is an explosion of Christianity in African countries, Latin America, South Korea, now more recently China and India. I can't remember the statistic, but one of the Middle Eastern countries, I don't know how they track all this, especially where Christianity is illegal, but they claimed that there were more people that came to faith like in one of the countries in the Middle East in the last few years than anywhere else in the world. And so the numbers and the growth of Christianity, maybe if you really delved into it, could possibly be a net gain at worst. So even though it's declining rapidly in the United States and in Europe, in white Western civilization. It is not declining rapidly in developing countries. It's actually exploding in a lot of these countries. But even a country like South Korea that's beyond developing and would be more Western of Asian countries, it's growing in South Korea rapidly. Like some of the biggest mega churches in the world are in South Korea. And then also, too, what is interesting and worth noting, because this is something we're passionate about, is you don't see the same flight from church in Black and Hispanic people, even that are educated and like are the same socioeconomic status of our fellow, like as what we know it to be. So like it's really a white, educated, affluent movement that is happening now. That's just most of like culture and art and thought comes out of that set. But to talk about us moving post-Christian or like beyond Christianity is really to talk about white Western civilization moving that way. And that's not, I mean, obviously there are Black atheists and Hispanic atheists and Latin atheists and all of that. Like I'm not saying that doesn't exist. It's just to say that like that is not happening in the same kind of way. One of the things I thought was really cool when I went to the church that I went to in Portland, all white. Like Portland's like one of the whitest places I've ever been, maybe second to only Denver. But like just white people everywhere. And like Anna and I laughed about it being here in Birmingham. Like you see Black people and interact with Black people and are friends with Black people. And like you couldn't find a Black person in Portland for the most part. Like everywhere we went, it was just white people. But there were Black Lives Matter like things everywhere. Like everywhere. Like every other window had a Black Lives Matter like poster or sticker or whatever. Cool, right? What was interesting is we go to church and like probably 10% of the people worshiping there are Black. And Anna and I just thought like that lines up with like what I'm talking about of like even in these really liberal progressive cities that care a lot about that, the Black community like isn't bothered by religion in the same kind of way that like white people in Western educated cultures are. And so that's when we talk about moving post-Christian, like we're talking about a small segment. And I say all that to say, as we conclude this class, like sort of pastorally, I hope this has been more than just some facts and knowledge and like helping our minds kind of wrap around history and specific authors or like thoughts and thinkers, but that we would really get that there's a sense like Christianity is so much bigger than like some of the problems we've encountered and some of the difficulties and things that we're sort of embarrassed by. Like there is this big sense of Christianity that's been moving for a long time. And like, I think that it would be important for us to sort of like keep that in mind when we encounter something where somebody lobs like a really large critique. And what may be better, and I said this in my sermon on Sunday, what may be a better response than being like, oh, you're right, this is a terrible white man's religion and we got to get out of it because it's misogynistic and patriarchal, is to go, oh, something happened somewhere along the way and that got infested into this really beautiful thing that has had a profound influence all over the globe in lots of people that aren't white or male or affluent or Western have been able to be influenced and shaped and formed by this. So maybe the problem lies in this really small, narrow view of it. And to articulate that or put a finer point on it, I'll say this last little bit, and this was the part I said I was going to save towards the end that I think is really interesting, is to think about some of the things that we find really influential or really like essential to Christianity, like things like family and how the family life works, are really, really new concepts. So like, it is not until just like the last 75 years post-World War II that like the family unit as like mom stays at home, kids go to school, dad goes to work and is the breadwinner. Like breadwinner as a term is only about 100, 105 years old. You get the first industrial revolution, late 1800s, second industrial revolution happens early 1900s. But it's like not until late 1800s that we even see the family idea that there would be like a living wage or a family wage. Because up until the Industrial Revolution, family units were producers together. There was a family business. My family business would have been running the mill. That's why we were millers. Like it wasn't just like your parents' surname or your dad's surname. Like the whole family did that. The whole family was a part of earning. If you had a farm, whatever it was, like you did that together as a family. And there wasn't this separation of duties in the same kind of way. Even if you start to study like what are gender norms through society. Like at this point in time, late 1800s, and even earlier than that, when you're hunting and you're farming, when like the guy was responsible for most of the cooking. It was a sense of pride. Now they were still, the reason they let the guy do it was still rooted in some misogyny. But gender norms have changed, and so things that we have been taught growing up are really, really narrow views. Again, like 20 years in the grand scheme of thousands and thousands of years, and like in Western thought compared to like all over the globe and the world. So families have changed and they ebbed and they have flowed, and like we hold on to some really strong core tenets of gender, things that we think are biblical, which a lot of us here probably would reject, but like that we would take issue with, and we take issue with those things and we assume that the issue is with Christianity. And really like what the issue is that there has been a drastic change in the way families are structured, and like we just haven't quite had time to deal with some of these things yet. And some of these things, they'll just work themselves out. It doesn't mean we shouldn't advocate for them and push back for them and seek change. It's just to say that like we're tempted to, I think, when we encounter an issue with Christianity, to go, oh, that whole thing's terrible, and out we go with it. But if you look at church history and how it has like ebbed and flowed, and how there's been good and there's been bad, and how sometimes you can't even separate the two all the time. Like you look at it and you go, yeah, that was really terrible, but like we also got these things out of it. We got modern medicine and hospitals and this idea out of monasteries, as Kyle talked about. Like even though the medieval times were dark, but there were good that came from that. And so that's my hope pastorally, is that as we look at this, that we can just sort of go like, hey, there does need to be reform. And hopefully we look at it and go, we are entering into a massive shift in the church, right? Like that's my hope. As families and these things are changing so rapidly, that like we'll sort of begin to get our bearings and our feet under us culturally and societally, which is when all these other reformations have happened. There's these huge shifts in technology. But like, Kyle talked about the printing press and how it just like revolutionized the church. Well, we're dealing with the age of the internet, and it's revolutionizing how we get information, and it's going to take some time for us to all kind of figure out how to use this stuff and to be a part of it, and I think the church will change and shift with it. So there is a lot we need to critique when we look at church history, and there's a lot we need to actively work together to change. We need to actively be anti-racist. Like we need to actively be looking to elevate women and to tear down some of the power structures that have been rooted with the church. Simultaneously, like a lot of this stuff is very small in the grand scheme of Christian thought. And so like I just don't want us to worry about Christianity. But it's like, hey, let's critique the problems that have taken foot and taken hold, and that we can like work with these things. But like the Lord is really, really good, and He's really, really faithful to us. And so I hope that we can like find ourselves like being caught up in that. The breadth and the width of Christianity as a whole, and not worry so much about something that may just be 10 years old versus the creed we say every Sunday that is, 1,700 years old. Like there's a big difference there. And one of those maybe we should trust a little bit more and have a little bit more faith in, and the other one we can go, yeah, that might not have, like that was a good idea. I see where it started from. But like its logical conclusion worked itself out pretty fast, and we're going to move on from it. And that's been happening in the church for 2,200 years, and like that's okay, and that's good, and like let's be a part of the change when it needs to be changed. Questions, comments?
when you brought up network Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
you nearly simultaneously brought up televangelism.
Yes.
And I thought of televangelism before you brought it up. I was, thinking along those lines. And then you compared network Christianity, or not compared, but you kind of like extrapolated it to now and how we have mega churches and we have, churches that are based around a celebrity pastor.
Yeah.
I thought of like Joel Osteen.
Yeah.
Or locally Chris Hodges.
Yeah.
People like that. But we don't, I don't personally think of televangelism in the way that I know was really popular in the 80s and 90s and things like that. So would you characterize like televangelism and network Christianity as like things that started together and then splintered off? Are they just coincidentally parallel? Are they not the same thing at all? What would you say?
I would say that some of you don't have them without the other, probably. But honestly, I would say you don't have mega churches and celebrity pastor culture without televangelism. And that is not to say that all televangelists are necessarily separate from network Christianity. But this idea that like thousands of people would consider this talking head on a screen their pastor happens through televangelism. And then when the technology forms for us to begin to make churches where we can pipe someone in and a talking head can be considered a thousand people's pastor. Now that's not to say that the pastor has to know every single person. I don't think if Mosaic grew to 500 people, it would be physically impossible for me to be on an intimate first name pastoral level. Hopefully that's where I think the priesthood of all believers is a beautiful thing. So I'm not critiquing mega churches in that sense. It's just to say that wouldn't have been possible without technology that started with TV. And I think it set the groundwork for what later would come. But there were pastors on the radio before that. And there were radio hours and things like that. But yeah, and that's what's interesting to see is movements in the church are always coinciding with demographic trends and societal trends and technological trends. And that was going on way back then, and it's going on now. And there's always an interplay between the two, I think. And sometimes churches, interesting, there are technological things that these mega churches that businesses are now going wait, we can do that. We can incorporate that into how we do things. So yeah, I would say that they started in a similar place. But yeah, they probably have branched off to some degree.
You raise an interesting point, just to continue the thought, that I made a distinction between televangelism in more of a pure sense from 20, 30 years ago versus mega churches now and what we think about. But Kenneth Copeland and Creflo Dollar,
right.
These the kind of televangelists who are advertising on TV, strangers, please just send me money.
Right.
I'm sure it exists, but it's not, I'm not as aware of it as much. But what you made me think of that's really interesting is with the advent of technology, and especially in the last year and a half and 2 years, so many churches have been broadcasting their services.
Yeah.
And so I think about a church like Church of the Highlands, for example. Chris Hodges doesn't get up there and say, "Send me money and good things will happen to you." But it's the really interesting concept that you pointed out of there's tons and tons and tons and tons of people that he has never met.
Yeah.
All across the state and country and world. It's almost like changing the definition of televangelism in a way because of the internet. So I don't have a question. That's just an interesting thought.
Yeah. And something that we, in some sense, have to... again, I try to say this all the time. It's one of my favorite phrases besides both and is good, bad, or indifferent. There's a way we have to, be honest about things. And I try to say that to say, we don't need to necessarily, condemn it or champion it. We just need to be honest about what happens and how souls are being formed, how souls are being shaped when we're doing these things. And some people may choose to go that route and some people may not. Personally, I think especially in post-pandemic life, and as the world and even America is becoming more urban, and as there's a push to things of a smaller, slower life, even in secular culture, some of the stuff Gisela was talking about at Wine Night, like this push towards farmers markets and being regional and local. I think the future of the church in at least the next 25 years is smaller. Bigger than Mosaic. I hope we grow. Like, I'm not saying like I think it's going to be 55 people, but I think seeing churches, I would like to think that we'll see more and more churches that are like 250, 350. Yeah, and that's not, again, not to dog mega churches, but I think that like just what humanity needs with where we are. And this is interesting too, because you want to talk about technology. There is this movement too in the last 10 years. Politically, it's how we've gotten into some of the problems we've gotten philosophically. But like now, you don't have to go to the same place to get information anymore. Like, we have become consumers of information, and we can pick and choose where we want. And so like pastors, I don't think necessarily, and you've maybe noticed this shift in my preaching to some degree or not, but like my primary role, I don't feel like is teaching quite as much as it would have been had I been a pastor in 81 instead of 21, right? Because like at that point in time, people wouldn't have had access. So I would have had this master's degree and this knowledge and these resources and tools and know how to use them. And so then like I think one of my primary roles or tasks would have been to then teach people. Now, obviously we still value this and I think it's important. And I think that people need to do that in an incarnational and like local context. But everything I have told you and talked about the last 4 weeks, you could go home and Google and find more qualified, higher, better produced, better engaging speakers. Like, I'm in no way, shape, or form the best at this or like the most qualified to do this. And people that are way more qualified than me have put all of their stuff online at this point. You may have to pay you may hit a paywall, but like, you guys can go learn about anything you want at any given point in time. And so I don't know if the primary role of the church so much anymore is to educate, because there's podcasts everywhere, there's YouTube videos everywhere, there's online classes everywhere. But I think the primary role of the church is to pastor and to prophetically speak into individuals' lives and to say like, we together are called to this and we need to move towards this. And so that's why I think that the future of the church, as like we've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger with technology, I think the future of the local church is to in some sense go smaller. Now, I think churches like Highlands will always exist and they will provide something for the people that want to look for that. But then I think as people get connected and involved, that like the real life of discipleship will happen in 250, 300 people. And I would love to see Mosaic grow. I'm not saying I want us to be 300 tomorrow, but like I think it would be really cool if Mosaic grew. But I don't have any intentions of us being 600-700 people like that. We would start doing things to actively dissuade that, to be quite honest, because I think that the future of what we need, especially in our generation, our age, the last 10, 15 years, I think that like we need some small churches where people can know one another, spend time around a table with one another, and really like be in community with one another, because technology has influenced and shaped the direction of the church so much. And so let's take advantage of it. I would tell you guys that in a heartbeat. And like in family life and stuff, like these big churches that are throwing these freaking awesome VBSs and summer camps, like send your kids to them, man, because we can't do anything like that. And there's some cool opportunities for kids there. Go to it. We're going to do something else, though. We're going to invite your kids into adult life and family life in a way that a big church can't. And it's two different things. And so I'd say the same thing about learn from these other pastors that you have access to them, and theologians and people on the internet. And so then I think it changes what we expect to do here. And that's something I'm really wrestling with on a personal level right now. But I saw that, I'm also listening to a really cool podcast that I'd highly suggest. It's called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It's by Christianity Today, which is the church out in Seattle with Mark Driscoll, if those names are familiar with you. But they get into a lot of this. So some of what I'm what I'm saying now is largely information that I have gleaned from that podcast, is because they kind of track, there's a book called The Rise of Network Christianity, and they kind of track how these networks sort of start to replace denominations, and they're built around the megachurch, and honestly, they're built around a franchise model. Just call it what it is. Some people would probably embrace that, and they'd be like, yeah, and other people are like, oh, that's not nice to call us that, but that's what they're doing. They're franchising their churches, and it works. It replicates.
I have a different question, but first of all, just as validation for that, for what we just talked about. I went to the Highlands all throughout undergrad, and I don't really have very many negative things to say about them, but I would say it wasn't until coming to Mosaic that we really felt like we experienced community and this whole being involved in kids' lives as a young couple that doesn't have kids and,
Right.
and being involved. And so I think I can see just in the track of my own faith and own experience in Christianity wanting to come to that place of, having that deeper community. So different question. You talked about how you feel like we're at the end of Christendom and moving into a more secular society, and that's not necessarily a negative thing. And I guess what comes to mind for me is an example of that, and I guess I want to know if that's kind of where you're going with this, but I think of how there's a history of white hetero men using Christianity to maintain control and abuse their power, and so I think that if we're moving in a more secular direction, there's less chances for that to happen.
Right.
Is that kind of the vein of thought that you're in with that, or are there other examples of how it might be a positive thing?
I think there would be other examples, but I think that that's a good one. And I think that that's what I would hope is going to continue to happen. Because, so think of what we talked about, what happens in England and the crisis of faith, and that, the art and literature, and they're moving to this direction where it's you tell them, well, God told me, and they're like, okay, well, I don't have to listen to you because, that's not real, or whatever. So, I think there is a way for, that to, and so then that's where I'm getting at of going, okay, let's deconstruct what you talked about without deconstructing the whole thing. We didn't even get into deconstruction, which is a movement out of postmodernism that happens. John Hick, I believe, is the guy's name that is most associated with this idea of deconstruction. And he's the one that gets into this idea that there's no meaning in the text. And so we can just make it say whatever we want, and people have. And anyways, we won't go into all that now. But a large part of postmodernism, no, not John. Anyways, now my mind's going blank. Jacques Derrida, French philosopher, is who is associated with deconstruction. So we see that happening, but that's what I'm getting at. It's hey, what you just articulated is a way that Christianity has been abused, and I think there's some good that we're exposing that. And so I would want to meet the person that gets out of that abusive relationship or how they have experienced that abuse of power, and say to them, there's way more to Christianity than that. And let me come and show it to you. And I think someone that maybe isn't as steeped in the negative cultural Christianity or hasn't been in it their whole life may go oh, yeah. I think they would maybe be more open to it. And I think it exposes the ways in which we've sort of just been Christians because that's what everybody is. The other example I would use is all the ways that we think we're Christian, but we're really just American. White, affluent Americans. And I think that moving past or becoming post-Christian, moving past a Christian society, helps us see that more clearly, of all the ways that we think we're Christian, but we're really just cultural products. Because we're all cultural products. That's okay. It's not wrong to be a product of your culture. It's just to understand where those lines are. But when you're in a Christian culture, predominantly Christian culture, it's harder to separate, well, is credit card debt a really terrible sin in Christianity, or is it just a terrible sin in white, affluent, homes? obviously it's not wise no matter what, because it's a terrible interest rate and you can lose a ton of money paying credit card debt. But like, like that's something I go back to all the time, because like growing up, like I just thought like, well, a good Christian would never go into credit card debt. And it was like, well, but no, that's just a product of my culture, and because my culture was really Christian, because that was a value culturally, we think that that's a Christian value. Being good with money, being a good steward of your money is a good Christian value, but that has more to do with generosity than it does how much savings you have in your retirement.
Say like the conflation of patriotism and
Absolutely.
evangelicalism.
Another one that, like, there's nothing wrong with being proud of being American. Like there's no reason of enjoying the fruits of our country despite all of its flaws as well. Like there's been good things that we've been given, and we've helped a lot of people and we've hurt a lot of people, But like there's nothing wrong with being patriotic, but it is not a requirement to be a Christian. And yeah, so that's like tearing those things down, of separating what we think it is to be like a good citizen and a good Christian are not necessarily the same thing, and that's okay. And I think getting post-Christian helps identify that more easily. Because again, these are the waters we swim in, these are the roads that we're walking on, and we can't change that. And the great challenge for our soul and for formation is realizing what it is that we need to do to follow after Jesus, and what it is that we need to do to just contribute and be a part of society. And those get conflated or interwoven, I think, easily in a Christian society. And this is like the more like arrogant, I'm always hesitant to say something like this, but I think in some sense it does mark those that are really like actively pursuing their faith, and those that are just doing it because like it's what they've always done. And when you're post-Christian, you don't have to go to church. I talked about that in a sermon a little while back. Like you go to like New York or London. Like I got to worship in some churches in London like several years ago while I was in seminary. And it was cool, man, because like nobody had to be there. Like there's an urgency about the people that follow Jesus, and there's a real bond in a city like that, where like if you decide to follow Jesus, like you go all in a different kind of way, because no one's making you. You don't need to. Yeah, or familial pressure even a lot. I mean, there might still be if your parents are Christians, but like it's just different when the social context is different. And so like I think that you see that, or hopefully we'll see that here as well. Like, oh, like if you're going to follow Jesus, like you're going to go all in. And that's what I'm after. I said, like, I don't care if Mosaic grows just because people want to come and sit in the seats. Like, that's not whatever. Like, if Mosaic's going to grow, I want them to grow because people are like excited and eager to pursue the kingdom of God in this context of Birmingham. And so I think moving post-Christian makes it easier to do that. There will be less people. Again, that's why I think the future of the church might be smaller. Like it's going to happen on a smaller scale, but I think it's better. Like, and this is my personality. Like I'd rather have one good friend than 10 mediocre friends. Like, and I struggled in college because of that. Like I would have rather had one real conversation than 5 surface level conversations. And so this is my personality coming out, so I need to acknowledge that might just be some of my own personal leanings, but I think that's what post-Christianity can give to us, and maybe why it doesn't bother me, where it might bother someone else. And that's okay. That's not me to say they're wrong. It's just to say, like, me personally, I don't get worried about that. I'm like, I actually think it might be a good thing. And I think it gives us an opportunity to use a big word that may have negative connotations, but I think it can give us a revival of different types of sorts. Or a reformation. Revivalism is something else that is really big. And that's an American idea in a lot of ways. They happen in Europe, but that is a very American, something that we really value as American Christians is revivalism. And it's like, well, that's really not a historical Christian idea in like the sense of going around and converting whole towns and then moving on. Like that's an American thought, but 19th century specifically.
Okay. My other question goes back to like talking about different pushbacks to Enlightenment.
Yeah.
I feel like what we see nowadays, or at least what I see a lot of, is let me back up. So I feel like what you were saying is there was a lot of people that were like, let's rationalize this, reason through this, and then the initial pushback was like, no, there's still mystery, there's still revelation. And I feel like what I see a lot of now is more like, I guess you'd say like anti-intellectualism and like anti-science, but not necessarily accompanied by there's mystery. And I'm wondering if that's a very new thing or if that has always kind of come along with Enlightenment as well.
I would say that is a 20th century idea. I would need to read more on that to like give you facts and data on that, like to be like for sure. But I think that that's like, not to throw them under the bus here, but I think that is like an like a movement of evangelicism that really grabs hold of that. I mean, the church has, in some sense, not always been super great with science and things. You know, kicking people out for thinking that the Earth is not the center of the solar system. Kicking people out of the church because they think the Earth is round and not flat. Like, so there's always been some, like, the church has always been a little slow to jump on new thoughts or ideas, and sometimes they have to come back around to it. And so because a lot of this has happened so fast, I guess, like, we could say in that, like, maybe it is just a slow acceptance of some new thoughts or ideas. But I would say it's mostly a reaction to the Enlightenment and a need to like defend against the Enlightenment that you see as like, or really probably liberal theology, which is a product of the Enlightenment. As that kind of like blows up and starts to happen late 1800s, early 1900s, German writers that are very fun to read and helpful, but it's kind of a pushback to them. We can't take anything that might not line up absolutely perfectly with all of our thoughts and ideas. And it's also honestly part of the Reformation. It's like holding on to some Reformation ideas of like sola scriptura. You know, oh, if the Bible doesn't say it, then, and it's like, well, that's not what sola scriptura was intended to mean or be, but we get that. Yeah, that's a good question. And good insight. Good. You want the microphone, Glenna? Cool. Thanks, y'all. I enjoyed this for 4 weeks.